Welcome to the Be Ruthless Show, where we have the conversations that other people don't, the conversations that other people won't. I'm your host, Sam Ruth, and I'm ready to make a lot of noise and disrupt things, ruthlessly. Thanks for being here today. Now let's get to it. Welcome back to the Be Ruthless Show. I'm your host, Sam Ruth, and joining me today is Susan Omilian. She's an author, attorney, and motivational speaker who's worked to end violence against women for the last 40 years. With the death of her 19-year-old niece, Maggie, killed in 1999 by her ex-boyfriend, Susan's work became more personal and immediate. She vowed to help victims move on after abuse, as Maggie could not. She's the originator and facilitator of My Avenging Angel Workshops, based on the idea that living well is the best revenge. Since 2001, her free workshops have helped hundreds of survivors take the journey beyond abuse from victim to survivor to thriver. Susan's innovative 7-step motivational model follows the 3 stages of recovery from trauma developed by Dr. Judith Herman, a psychiatrist best known for developing the diagnosis of complex PTSD. Prior to this work, Susan founded a sexual assault crisis center, worked as a courtroom victim advocate, and represented domestic violence victims as an attorney in divorce cases. She also led psychoeducational groups for male domestic violence offenders for 15 years. What a resume. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
You are taking such a personal tragedy and turning it into something beautiful. And I know so many people have been affected by abuse and suffer in silence.
That is true. And I think over the years that I've worked at this, done this work for about 40 years, I think there's more awareness of issues. There's more awareness of the warning signs. There's more awareness of there are services and people to help you. There's also more awareness that it's recognized as a thing, not just something that happened to you personally. And for a lot of women, they think, oh, well, this is just because I'm doing something wrong, or I should have done that, or I should have, been more whatever. And so I think that movement, I mean, it's in my lifetime, there were not domestic violence shelters. There were not rape crisis centers. So we have moved exponentially to at least acknowledge the issue and what's going on with it, but we still haven't got enough people educated. And I wouldn't even say that it's necessarily young people, although young people certainly should understand it and know it from a very, I wouldn't say a young age, but to at least recognize that somebody's being mean to somebody and we should do something about it. But I think also that there's an idea that this problem is never going to go away and we can't stop it. And I don't think that's true.
We can stop it by talking about it. And it's so funny that you just said that. My dad is getting older and his hearing is declining. And so he's just louder. And my nieces will say, Papa, why are you yelling? Don't be mean. And he's not. He just is truly strict. But having them point that out is helpful for him. He doesn't recognize. So even when people aren't arguing, if we don't find a way to discuss it or point it out, it would go on.
Right. And I think kids need to see that that's not, I wouldn't say it's not normal, but there's something about that engenders some impact on the other person. And one of the things we've been talking a lot lately in our society is about empathy, standing in somebody else's shoes. How would that feel for them? And so when we think about how people act, it's not so much what they're doing, but how it might also impact the other person. And that other person may or may not feel comfortable saying, excuse me, this is really making me terrified, or this is really making it difficult for me. Or even just saying, I feel uncomfortable. Even that word is really helpful. And that feedback will hopefully make that person change. But if they don't get that feedback, they're just thinking, like your example, that's just okay. But it's not, it may be okay for some people, but it may also be not okay. And it may also trigger other people's trauma, past trauma. Years ago, I used to do sexual harassment work with employers. This is way back when it was just a really new issue. And, they always say, well, I don't understand why this rape joke is a big deal in the workplace. Well, you don't know how many women may have been raped, and they're not going to tell you. And you shouldn't ask them to tell you. There's a universal assumption that this is not happening in the world around us, and in fact, it is.
And it's happening to men. It happens
Right.
to everyone.
Right.
And I have somehow, my parents did not teach me to be outspoken. I'm the person that just always would say, this is making me uncomfortable. Why is this happening? And that's not always a good thing.
Right.
But it at least gets a conversation going, where if you bite your tongue and you sit back, you're giving the message that the behavior is okay, or that you can tolerate.
Right. And then I think what we're beginning to learn is that in some situations that stepping out there and saying something may in fact be dangerous. So that's when you need to look for other kinds of help. And there are some people that would stimulate them to become more aggressive, or that the idea that you're in a coercive control kind of situation, and that's a manipulation. So it's not so much that we shouldn't recognize it and perhaps speak up, but also recognize it, unlike my niece's situation, where she didn't recognize it, that she was in danger just because he had never physically hit assaulted her before he killed her. So that, she kept trusting him, that based on his past behavior, but not what he potentially could do. And that's really hard to figure out, in the moment. So that's when the helpers can help you. And
I think it's important to note that the helpers do not encourage you to be aggressive or not yourself. It's about finding a way for you to speak up that's true and comfortable to you.
Right.
And maybe there's an assumption that you have to do it a different way. And that's not true either.
Right. And I always, tell women, and that's why I'm not a big fan of self-defense classes. Not that there's not a place for it, physical self-defense classes, because most of the people that I know who've assaulted women are actually someone you know. So it's not like it's a stranger kind of, that's certainly a situation, but there's a little bit more finesse to it. And not to say that won't be something that might give you strength to learn that kind of, taking care of yourself and physically taking care. But then there's also a lot of nuances to it. And there's also lots of ways that, even to know that, as we were speaking in the beginning, to know that something that's coming at you is not right. It's making you feel bad. And even to make that feedback is a step. And for many women, the characteristic that I understand that many women who've come through particularly abuse situations, domestic violence, intimate partner relationships, is that people-pleasing kind of thing that women are taught, or maybe part of their personality, and which is not a bad thing. It's just in a relationship with a manipulative person, that is where the danger starts to lie, because they keep trying to please and please and please. And there's been so much more information about that out there in the media, particularly around narcissism, that explains it a bit more. So once again, I learned this back in the 1960s and 70s in consciousness raising groups, was the personal is political. It's not just happening to you. There's people who can describe this and perhaps give you some more information, and you could seek them out. And they're not necessarily people that need to know a whole lot about it. What I find interesting when I was doing offender groups with male domestic violence offenders is that their kids were calling them out, and the kids were calling them out on some of their behavior, particularly some of the verbal abuse, because they were required to take bullying lessons in school about school bullies. But it's the same language, verbal abuse. So they were like calling out dad, that's verbally abusive. And he's like, how did they know that? And it's like, and I bet they're taking bullying and curriculums. And he's like, yeah, that's right. So just giving language is even the first step. And then it's not like just happening to me, but gee, somebody else has described it.
I think so great that you're focusing on this makes me feel uncomfortable, because culturally, I was just having a conversation with someone who said, in my culture, we yell. Yeah. That's just what we do. And it doesn't have to continue that way. If it bothers you and you express that, there's no guarantee, but people can at least hear and understand your needs.
Right.
Absolutely. What do we do what were the signs besides it's just verbal that women ignore and overlook?
I think it's a lot of the idea that they're trying to maintain a relationship with somebody who is manipulating them. That's certainly what happened to my niece, is that although he physically never touched her and never threatened her, and she didn't know he had a gun, which was information that he kept from her purposely, that she called him immature. I think it was, but a sign that she kind of, I wouldn't say she missed it, but she didn't see it in the list. First of all, on this campus, they never handed out a list of warning signs, which would have been helpful. When I went there after her murder and I did a talk, I handed out the list and the girls were all checking things off. And it was not just in terms of my niece's friends, but women who were in relationships, or my girlfriend's in a relationship, and oh my God, this is what he's doing. So, and there wasn't physical violence. So the idea that, for example, pushing the relationship too far, too fast, that's a warning sign. That's a manipulation. That's you saying, no, I don't want to go here, and you want to go there. And then a lot about just how they, name calling and little insults that maybe kind of be presented as jokes, particularly about the idea that you can't talk to another man, you can't, interact with another man because now you're cheating on me, and then this whole sort of blow up kind of thing. So the idea that this is a controlled environment in which you're living. Yeah. And you're trying to please this person because that's what, women are, I wouldn't say we're not trained. Well, trained, I guess is probably a good word. We tend to be empathetic. That's by our biology, by our nature as nurturers. But we also can overplease or give ourselves away, let's say that. Now, my niece was very feisty and very much an independent woman, young woman, but she also, got sort of sucked into all this. And then when she tried to break up with him, he would not let her go, which was another sign, refusal to accept the end of the relationship. So when her girlfriend saw the list afterwards, they could now have words for some of these things. And the second part of that equation was if they had those words, or even had less than those words, would somebody at the college at that time have done something about it? I don't know the answer to that. From my contact with the college afterwards, I don't think so. And I think my niece realized that the helpers weren't going to help her because he had never physically assaulted her. Maybe if he had assaulted her, and maybe if it had been in public where people saw it and there were witnesses, maybe there would have been like a ding dong, ding dong. But those are all words that were in the vocabulary. Since she was killed about 20 years ago, since Maggie's death, there's been a couple other words added to the vocabulary in the national and international language, and that's coercive control. And I think that actually describes better what was going on there. And she was trying to deal with a very manipulative person with her own little, feeling like, oh, I should let him down easier, so I'll keep going and talking to him, and it'll be okay. Because I still trust him because he is this person. He hasn't shown me this other person. And that's, I think, where it all happens. The other thing that I learned working with offenders after Maggie's death is that they also have tremendous trauma histories. And so you don't know what triggers them. And I always say to women, well, he only is verbally abusing me. It's not dangerous. I'm like, but you don't know what that moment is. And certainly the moment when you reject him, that could be the moment when he goes someplace that he's never gone before. And you may also go someplace that you haven't gone before, which is either to isolate yourself or to strike out. And it's just a situation that's hard for a person to manage in the emotional environment that they're in. And that's when the helpers need to come in. And that didn't happen either.
In my life, again, as women, have always been told how sensitive I am. And so somewhere along the line, I developed this internal message that it must be me. I must take things really differently than other people. So I started saying to people, can I just tell you something that happened? Will you tell me if I'm overreacting? And that turned into that is the biggest tool now. I stumbled upon it accidentally, but getting validation from others that would hurt my feelings too. And that's not okay. Is helpful, even in non-abusive relationships, just to learn our boundaries and how we deserve to be treated and if I kept it to myself, I would have thought, oh, Sam, you're just being sensitive, right? And then getting that feedback gave me a little bit of fire under my butt. Like, no, this isn't right. So there's also, even if you're not reaching out to a professional or to someone, a hotline, even if you don't want to go that far, running it by someone just to get another opinion is huge, because we have blind spots and we see the best in people we love, and we don't want to see those ugly things, and our loved ones see them.
Right. Yeah, I think I'm a highly sensitive person, and one of the things that I've learned about it is that I'm a highly sensitive person. So I am going to react to things differently. And I've given myself that. And I agree with you. I sort of do the same thing as I check it out with a couple people. I also have heard women tell me that they checked it out with a couple of people, particularly his family. And then his family says, well, that's how, that's just how we roll here. And so it's not a really good meter of all of that.
Right.
What's really important is that you, and I wouldn't say you have to feel comfortable every moment of your life in a relationship, because there are ups and downs to it, but there are things that you can't ignore, or at least there's a cumulative effect. There's a number of things that keep stacking up and stacking up. Now, one of the reasons why an extremely abusive, a manipulative, abusive person keeps you away from your family and friends is exactly for that reason. Because, Maggie's friends all said, this guy, we're so glad you broke up with him, because he's just like, we don't know what's going on with him. So it's also important to pick a few people that are not going to say, oh, honey, this is how it is in a relationship. It's okay. No, these are, and that's why I think it's so important, starting with the bullying curriculum, to give young women and men the words, the labels, the more common vernacular today than there used to be. And now we're getting even more specific, particularly, when most of the criminal laws that are the crimes that are possible in these kind of situations are usually only crimes that involve physical assaults or threatening. The other kinds of manipulations, the verbal abuse and insults and all kinds of ways that somebody intimidates you, those are not necessarily crimes in the criminal vernacular here, but they usually will be taken into account in the law, particularly around custody battles now. Stalking laws are very specific about threats and that are not nonverbal. So it's still important to understand that and to report that, or at least talk to somebody, if not who's in the law enforcement, but somebody that you trust. And usually it's an advocate, because the advocates can hear that language.
And advocates mostly don't stop and they don't take no. They are fighting full force.
Right.
And so even if you are told one thing by somebody, a professional, if it doesn't feel right, that there could be more that can be done. So I think finding an advocate that you really connect with is so important.
Right. And not wait till it gets to a point where when I was doing the offender groups, these guys were all arrested, usually for lower level misdemeanors, pushing and shoving and threatening and that kind of stuff. And one of the programs I was in, we actually had a victim support group, so that along with what we were doing with the men, the women were also invited. They weren't required to, but to come in and to do kind of a psychoeducational group too. This is what when I was doing offender groups, I actually did some groups with women offenders, women who were usually, because at least in our state, there was a very high dual arrest rate. That meant the police would show up and they couldn't figure out who did what to whom, so they arrested both people. What the hell? Let's just arrest them both and see if the judge can figure it out. And so these women would come into my offender groups, psychoeducational offender groups, and they were actually victims. And when I ran the warning sign list with them, they were all like, "Oh my God, I didn't know." So, and that was a cruel way to be educated about it. But also it was the idea that in many cases, and I have worked with gay men who were the victims in a domestic violence, and they represent the same kind of characteristics as a victim. It's, as a woman victim. It's not it's universal. It's not, but it's so hard when so much of the male culture is reinforces this without, particularly in specific cultures. It's really, really, and the laws in some of the countries that I work with men who came from different countries, the laws weren't there. So in their mind, it was like, this is not in our country, this is not something that you're going to get arrested for. So that's just, there's something wrong with us getting arrested here. Well, in our country, it is not okay. And not only in domestic violence, but also in child abuse. And so that kind of cultural differences were really hard for them to understand. And many of the women they were involved with were women from this country. So they had a whole different frame of mind.
And I want to throw out, I just did this episode on Monday. 988 is the new universal code for any and everything. It's not only suicide now, it is for abuse, alcohol, and drugs. So if you have questions, if you're concerned, you can call and get a trained professional immediately and find help in your area and get answers. And I love that that's available and that it's anonymous and people can just have a 3-digit, easy to remember code, and it's trained professionals. So tell me about your books.
So I have been, so in my process, although I used to do a lot of work with women directly who were victims of domestic violence, like I said, you said in my bio, as an attorney, when Maggie was killed, I could not go back there. I thought that was where I was supposed to go, but every woman in the shelter was Maggie, and I just couldn't manage that. So something else was going on here. That there was something I needed to do. That was really clear, but I wasn't going to go back to that. So I got the idea because Maggie didn't have that really clear warning sign, physical violence, that he could kill her. The moment of her death is when she really realized that this is what's happening and she wasn't going to get out of this. At least not on a human plane. And so I thought that's a really powerful moment. And if women have that moment to decide to leave and to move on or to do something different, then let's see what that power is, because Maggie didn't have that moment. And I wanted to give that moment to somebody else. So I started thinking about what would that be, because I was on my own journey to sort of move through this kind of victimization. The young man who killed my niece killed himself. It was a murder-suicide. So I didn't have that revenge kind of thing you have, avenging somebody, although it's really terrible process as a victim of violence to go, family to go into court and listen to that whole thing. It's happened with the Parkland, the case. It just came now. They're sentencing the young man who killed all the students and the teachers in Parkland, and you can hear what's happening in the courtroom. These families are just agonizing to even see this guy, let alone have somebody, say that he shouldn't go to prison for the rest of his life. Anyway, so I decided that I wanted to do something, and I'm a lawyer. I'm not a clinical person. I used to run creativity workshops, but so I devised this workshop, and I called it My Avenging Angel. Living well is the best revenge. And that's really what I started thinking about. If I can't avenge him by what happened to Maggie, by taking him to court and throwing him in jail, then I got to find another way to do that. And I thought, well, that's right. He destroyed my niece. He's trying to destroy my family. There's no way this is going to happen. Plus, I want to not get stuck in my anger. I want to find something good to happen. So I started doing these workshops, and I put together what I call the 7 steps to thriving. I can't tell you how I did that. It's sort of like this thing that these exercises, I'm a writer, so I've taught writing for many years. So I started working with these women, and they were mostly out of the abuse, out of abusive relationships. I also work with women who are sexual assault victims, incest survivors. I make sure they're safe, and then we don't talk about that part at all. We start to move from, and for many of the women, they don't really get, because no one's had words for it, that they can do more than survive what happened to them. And that there's a part of them that's been untouched by all that's ever happened to them, which really kind of freaks them out. Like, there's a part of me that's untouched. It feels like everything's been destroyed. And we start to see if we can bring that part up. I call it Thriver, so victim to survivor to thriver. So I've developed these materials. I call it the ThriverZone materials, getting you into the Thriver zone, and then really starting to work on setting new goals for yourself, setting new ways that you might think about where you want your life to go, and not only for yourself, but also for your children. With having done the workshops now for about 20 years, about 10 years ago, I thought, because I'm a writer, I should write a book about this. So I put them together in actually 3 workbooks. The first work was called Entering the Thriver Zone, and the second one's called Staying in the Thriver Zone, and then finally is Living in the Thriver Zone. And all the exercises that I do in the workshop are there kind of in a workbook fashion, plus a lot of samples. I always feel that the women tell the story better about how I've helped them than I can tell the story. And so the last book actually is 7 women who've come through my program. I have a workshop, and then I have a follow-up program. So many of these women I've actually have known for almost 15, 20 years. They are part of that book and talk about their process and how it helped them. So those are my workbooks that I've put together. And I also, I still do workshops. So I'm still doing, actually I'm now doing the workshops virtually since COVID gave me this opportunity. I wasn't sure I could translate them because I used to do it in a big room and we had arts and crafts and everything.
But now you're probably reaching so many more people.
I know. I have women from all over the country. I have women from South Africa who was just thrilled to come on, although she had to figure out the time zone difference and all this stuff, but she did. So I think that's the next part of this movement. I think that, I started the movement in the 40 years ago when we were, like I said, didn't have domestic violence shelters, didn't have rape crisis centers. We weren't even working on that victimization, that stabilizing, getting women safe and stable. That's the first step in Dr. Herman's 3-step process. When I read Dr. Herman's book, it's like, oh yeah, that's right. That's the first step, victim. And then she talks about the second step as remembering and mourning, really beginning to see, not only what happened to you now, but maybe there's a trauma history that there's things that have been happening to you all along that have just made you feel like you're only surviving. What's the next thing that's going to happen? I can survive anything. And I'm saying to women, that's a lot of energy just surviving. Let's see if we can move that energy someplace else. And so that's where I've taken them to, which is in Dr. Herman's language, integration, reintegration, and reconnection. She says that trauma and abuse sort of disconnects you and disempowers you. Then the process of recovery is moving into reintegration and reconnection, and particularly reconnecting to that positive energy inside you, the part of you that's been untouched by all that's ever happened. And then women who share that kind of same vision. And that's why I don't have the women tell their abuse story when they come into my workshops. Make sure they're safe and they're out, and they're through the crisis of the sexual assault. But we try to leave that part behind because the new story they want to tell, and I say this to them all the time, if you meet somebody on the street or someone that knows your background, yeah, they kind of want to know what happened to you. What they really want to know is how'd you get from survivor to thriver? Because they want to know, if you could do that, maybe I can do it too. And it may not even be for a domestic violence, sexual assault in the traditional words, but a lot of the women I work with have child abuse, trauma histories. So it's a combination. Maybe it's sexually harassed at work someplace. Maybe it's just the way that we were talking before, how women are treated, that the combination has allowed you to shut yourself off from the idea that there could actually be joy in your life, and that some of the dreams that you've had to go back to school, get a better job, start a business is really possible. And those steps and my follow-up program allows them to keep stay in contact and set that goal and to keep on working on it. And we do regular visioning stuff. So I think that kind of process for me is really what I wanted to write about in my books and what I want to continue to have women access to. And I think it's something we need to integrate into the larger service component, that women need to do more than just come out of it and survive it, but to really move on. Some of the people I've talked to in some of the programs around the country that have been connecting with me because of my materials say that they're seeing women return. They're seeing the children of the women they served 20 years ago come as grown adults in abusive relationships. So there has not been, the cycle of violence has not been broken within the generations, but even within their own lifetime. The women I have worked with, the ones who stayed with me, come to my workshop, stay with me in the follow-up program, the ones that have been in contact with me, none of them have returned to an abusive relationship. In fact, several have moved on to very healthy relationships. So it is possible. But I
want to take a minute to point out that you went through the loss of your niece. I went through loss, and part of healing, no matter what your journey, you made a change. And you talked about how you didn't go back to the shelters. It was just too difficult. Right. And for me, I didn't know that I would ever see clients again. And so I think mourning the loss of the life you were living and determining what is next for the rest of my life. How do I, that's such a crucial step, no matter what you're going through. If you're listening, that's part of healing. Right. So you can help anyone. They don't have to have whatever situation they're dealing with. These workbooks and this still applies and can help someone who's stuck.
Yeah, and I think that stuckness is where the victimization might come back in again, or that you're seeing your life in victimization mode. So everything feels, I mean, you know, when your car breaks down, that's a victimization. And I mean, you can experience that as a victimization, that, you know, why is this happening to me? Has this always happened to me? I can't understand it. You know, other people have cars, and then you sort of get into that mode, and everything is in that kind of feeling mode. You know, I say to people, I can't stop going back there sometimes. You know, Maggie and I have the same birthday. So on my birthday, I can go back there on the day that's the anniversary of her death, the day she died. That will take me back there. But I can decide how long I'm going to stay back there. And I can decide in what frame of mind. So I have a new book coming out. It's my third novel. I wrote a series of novels loosely based on Maggie's story. That I always have a book signing on October 17th, which is Maggie's anniversary. So I make that day be something very positive.
So amazing. So I'm considering launching my book on the 5-year anniversary of losing Jim. And I'm thinking, am I going to be able to physically be present for that full day? And what a great way to spend it. And I think it's so great that you talked about people dealing with loss and people, the love of your life. It really does feel like surviving. I got through the holidays. I got through the anniversary. It can be more than that. And it seems foreign and so far out of reach. And you don't have to know what it is. You just have to be willing to consider what's next. And so I love this.
Thank you.
Tell us more about the book.
Well, I also think that the process of grieving a loss, particular loss of a loved one, is very similar. I mean, you know, in fact, when I was doing offender groups, I would actually, and my curriculum, I added grieving, the 5 stages or 8, whatever stages of grief. And I said, you know, okay, so let's just think about this broadly, guys. You've lost a relationship. You've maybe lost a job because you got arrested, and maybe you lost, you know, family, whatever. Who no longer think of you as this really, you know, good guy. That's a loss. Let's talk about it in terms of loss. What are the stages? You know, anger. You're angry right now. You got arrested. You know, depressed. You're sad. You know, and then there's that acceptance. You know, so it's a very similar process. And I think it's, you know, the idea that there's stages, and you're going to move through them, and you're going to go back and forth. It's not a linear process. You know, today I feel like a thriver because I'm talking to you about it. You know, tomorrow something could happen and I'm like, you know, it's not a really good day, but that doesn't mean my whole life has been destroyed. And the idea that you're on this journey is really one of the first things I do. And my first of the 7 steps is see your journey. And I can't tell you how many women, when I go through this little exercise and we actually use a story, a children's story, they're like, I didn't know I was on a journey. Why didn't anybody tell me I was on a journey? It's like, I've been in therapy and no one told me I was on a journey. I've been a victim my whole life in my mind. And you're telling me I can be something else. So I think that, and I think in COVID time, this has also come up a lot, because people who were otherwise healthy or maybe not marginally, were managing their health issues, suddenly got this disease and either died or have long haul COVID. And it's going to be, I think healing has become a much clearer, what's the word? Not a path, but I think people are getting clearer that their healing is possible, that is a process, and it's not a linear process. You're going to come back and forth, and you need to know, as you know, your trauma triggers. What's going to trigger you? What's that day or the moment that's going to hit you? And how do you manage that? So how do you surround yourself with people? And how do you see that this is just a moment and you don't have to be stuck in it for 5 years? And acceptance will come at some point, but it's going to be with sadness. There's no question about it. There are things we cannot control. And I think that's something I've learned in my life, is that I still feel a lot of guilt about Maggie. I knew things that I didn't know she needed to know, or at least to reinforce. And she tried to solve this problem all by herself. And that's not how our family operates. But in this situation, we had no control over that. What I do have,
and that's why we're having this conversation, is so that anyone listening knows that keeping it silent is the worst.
Right.
You don't have to go on a podcast, but you can let one person in.
Right. And I don't think you need eloquent language either. It'd be great to have all the right terms so that people are like, oh, this is verbal abuse. But even to be able to describe it, and what I used to tell the guys when I taught the offender group is that what you did and the impact on the other person. And when they wrote those empathy letters, I mean, they were like, oh, I didn't realize, And in fact, they didn't realize that they had the same impact on being arrested. That they were embarrassed and sad and upset and angry, and that's the same thing that their partner had in terms of the relationship. You hurt this person, and she expected you not to do that. So you stand in the same shoes, and understanding that more, I think, is what was really hard. I think ultimately that when we see what's going on across the board with identifying more of this, I think what I'm hoping for is that we see more, as you and I are talking about, that the path is very similar, and we need to teach that path more.
Absolutely.
And if we don't teach that path, or at least give words to it, we have a word called healing. But sometimes people think about that in a medical sense, not a spiritual sense. We have the word recovery. Sometimes that word is kind of more associated with substance abuse recovery. We don't really have this word. And that's what I think COVID is kind of giving us, is we haven't got a word yet. I like to say it be thriving, but and the women that I work with love it when I give them a word for it. It's like, oh, now I have a word for this thing.
I know, it's so great. This has been so amazing and so helpful for so many people. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For your time and your story. How do people connect with you?
So I have a website. It's called ThriverZone.com. Not surprisingly, I do have workshops coming up. They're free. I always do free workshops, and they're virtual. You can go onto ThriverZone.com or directly to the website for my workshops, myavengingangel.com. Love to have you come. I have women from all over the place coming. And you can also purchase my books on ThriverZone.com and also on Amazon. Thank you so much.
And it's Susan at ThriverZone.com if anyone wants to reach out to you.
Yes, that's my email. Yes.
Thank you so much. These are the conversations we need to be having. Thank you so much for being so open and honest and sharing your time and your wisdom. ThriverZone.com, Susan at ThriverZone.com. And until next time, everyone, always be ruthless.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening today. Your support means everything to me, truly. If this podcast resonates with you, please do me a favor and join in the Ruthless movement by making some noise and doing one of these 4 things. Subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Tell a friend so we can break stigmas even faster. Leave a review so people can see what you think of the show. And last, if you want to learn more about me and be a part of the Grief Hab community, please head on over to the Facebook group. We'd love to have you. Thanks again for spending your time with us, and see you next week.